haunted cargo. Trucker life was simple for Jake Big Rig Henderson. Drive, deliver, and get paid. He'd been behind the wheel of his 18-wheeler for over 15 years, hauling everything from frozen meat to heavy machinery across the highways and byways of the United States. There wasn't much he hadn't seen or heard in his time on the road, and very little fazed him. But when the job came in that night, something about it just didn't feel right. Jake had been sitting at a small truck stop in rural Arizona, enjoying a cup of coffee and a slice of pie, when the call came. It was an anonymous voice, calm but firm, offering him a well-paying gig with minimal details. All Jake knew was that he had to pick up a cargo from a remote location near the Nevada border and take it to a warehouse outside of Los Angeles. The instructions were simple: don't ask questions, don't look inside the trailer, and deliver it by dawn. For $20,000 in cash, it seemed too good to be true. Jake wasn't one to turn down easy money. Times had been tough, and with a repair bill for his truck looming, he couldn't afford to be picky. But as he drove through the desolate desert toward the rendezvous point, his gut twisted. Something about this job felt wrong. The road stretched ahead like a black ribbon cutting through an endless sea of sand, and the only sound was the rumble of his engine and the whistling wind. The pickup location was a barren, abandoned lot near an old, dilapidated gas station. No buildings, no lights, just a long, lonely trailer waiting for him in the middle of nowhere. It was plain, no markings, nothing that identified it, except for a single lock on the back. He pulled his truck alongside it, the headlights casting eerie shadows on the rusted metal. As soon as he stepped out, a man dressed in black emerged from the darkness, his face obscured by the brim of a wide hat. "You Henderson?" the man asked, his voice a low growl. Jake nodded, not bothering with pleasantries. The man walked toward him and handed him a thick envelope of cash. His hand was cold and clammy, like he'd been standing in a freezer for hours. "Remember, no questions, no peeking," the man said, before disappearing into the night as quickly as he'd appeared. Jake watched him go, a shiver creeping up his spine. For a moment he considered leaving the trailer behind and driving away, but the weight of the envelope in his hand reminded him of why he was here. He hooked the trailer to his rig, climbed back into the cab, and started the long journey to Los Angeles. Chapter 1. The First Signs. For the first hour, the drive was uneventful. The desert stretched endlessly in every direction, the stars above twinkling in the night sky, and the highway was completely deserted. Jake kept his radio on low, listening to classic rock to keep himself awake. He had made hauls through the desert before, but something about this stretch of road felt different tonight, like it was somehow alive. His mind wandered back to the instructions: don't open the trailer. Why? It wasn't the first time he'd been told to mind his own business, but never with this level of secrecy. He couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right about the cargo. That's when he heard a faint scratching sound, like fingernails dragging across metal. It was so soft at first, Jake thought he'd imagined it. He turned down the radio and listened carefully. The noise grew louder, a slow, rhythmic scraping, like something or someone was inside the trailer, trying to get out. Jake's heart skipped a beat. He kept his eyes on the road, telling himself it was just the trailer settling, maybe a loose piece of metal shifting with the wind. But the noise didn't stop. Instead, it began to change, now accompanied by faint whispers, muffled voices, indistinct but unmistakable, echoing from the back of his truck. He felt a chill wash over him. His hands tightened on the steering wheel as the whispers grew louder, more insistent, as if whoever or whatever was inside was getting impatient. Jake turned up the radio, drowning out the noises, but the feeling of dread gnawed at him. He had never felt so unsettled behind the wheel before. After another 20 minutes, the noises became impossible to ignore. It was no longer just scratching and whispers. He could hear thumping now, something heavy hitting the walls of the trailer. Jake's foot hovered over the brake pedal. He wanted to stop, to check, to see what the hell was going on back there. But the man's words echoed in his head: no questions, no peeking. He pressed on, gripping the wheel tighter. But as the noises grew louder and the whispers more frantic, he couldn't take it anymore. The road ahead was empty, not a soul in sight. Against his better judgment, he pulled the truck onto the shoulder, the headlights casting eerie shadows across the desert. Chapter 2. The First Look. Jake killed the engine and sat in the silence of the cab, his heart thudding in his chest. He glanced in his rearview mirror, half expecting to see someone standing behind his truck. But the night was still. With a deep breath, he grabbed his flashlight and climbed out of the cab, his boots crunching on the gravel as he made his way to the back of the trailer. The scratching had stopped. The whispers were gone. All he could hear was the soft rustling of the wind. He approached the trailer, the heavy lock glinting in the moonlight. His hand hovered over it, his curiosity warring with his common sense. What could possibly be inside? Was it alive? Human? Before he could decide, the trailer jolted. Something slammed against the inside, so hard that it shook the entire rig. Jake stumbled back, his heart racing. A low, guttural growl reverberated from within the metal walls, followed by a series of loud thuds like fists pounding against the door. Fear gnawed at his gut. He had to know what was inside. Ignoring the warning, he grabbed the lock with shaking hands and fumbled with the key. As soon as the lock clicked open, the air around him seemed to change. It grew heavy, thick with an unnatural stillness. Even the wind seemed to die. Jake took a step back, the trailer door creaking open just enough for him to peer inside. He aimed the flashlight into the darkness, and for a moment he saw nothing, just empty space. But then, the light caught something, a figure, hunched, emaciated, its pale skin stretched tight over its bones. Its eyes, wide and vacant, stared back at him, hollow and soulless. Before he could react, the figure lunged. Chapter 3: The Visions. Jake stumbled back, dropping his flashlight. The figure vanished as quickly as it had appeared, leaving nothing but darkness behind. His breath came in ragged gasps, his mind reeling. Had he imagined it? Was it a trick of the light? But as he stood there, trying to make sense of what he'd seen, the world around him began to shift. The desert, the road, the truck, it all seemed to blur, twisting into something unfamiliar. The air grew thick, oppressive, and the ground beneath him seemed to pulse with a strange energy. Then the visions began. He saw flashes of people, dozens of them, all emaciated, their faces gaunt and hollow, their eyes lifeless. They were trapped inside the trailer, banging on the walls, their mouths open in silent screams. Their bodies were contorted, twisted in unnatural ways, as if they had been tortured for years. And standing among them was the figure he had seen, the one that had lunged at him. But now, it was clearer. It wasn't human. Its face was twisted, monstrous, with long, sharp teeth and eyes that gleamed with malevolence. The vision shifted again, and now Jake saw something else: an altar, surrounded by candles. A group of people in dark robes stood around it, chanting in a language he couldn't understand. On the altar lay a body, lifeless, pale. And then the body moved. Jake staggered back, the vision snapping away as quickly as it had come. He was back in the desert, standing beside his truck, the trailer still slightly open. His heart pounded in his chest, and cold sweat dripped down his face. He slammed the trailer door shut and locked it, his hands shaking uncontrollably. He had no idea what he was transporting, but he knew one thing: it wasn't human. Chapter 4: The Final Leg. Jake climbed back into the cab, his hands trembling as he gripped the steering wheel. Whatever was in the trailer, it wasn't alive, or at least, not in any way he could understand. But he still had a job to do. He started the engine and pulled back onto the road, determined to deliver the cargo and get as far away from it as possible. But the further he drove, the worse things got. The whispers returned, louder now, more insistent. The scratching became relentless, as if whatever was inside the trailer was desperately trying to escape. The visions, too, came in waves, horrifying images of tortured souls, trapped in an endless cycle of suffering. As the night wore on, Jake's mind began to unravel. He could no longer distinguish between reality and hallucination. The road ahead twisted and warped, the sky above him swirling with unnatural colors. And through it all, the whispers grew louder, until they weren't just whispers, they were screams. By the time Jake reached the warehouse outside of Los Angeles, he was barely coherent. His hands shook as he parked the truck, his mind racing with images of the horrors he had witnessed. A group of men in dark suits emerged from the shadows, their faces cold and expressionless. "Did you open the trailer?" one of them asked. Jake shook his head, his mouth dry. He wanted to lie, but the words wouldn't come. He simply nodded, his body trembling. The men exchanged a glance before one of them stepped forward, a small, knowing smile on his face. "You shouldn't have done that," the man said quietly. Before Jake could respond, the men turned and walked away, disappearing into the darkness with the trailer in tow. Jake was left alone in the silence, the weight of his decision hanging heavy in the air. He never found out what was in that trailer, and he never wanted to. But from that day on, the visions never left him. No matter how far he drove, no matter how many miles he put between himself and that haunted cargo, the whispers followed him, always just beyond the edge of hearing. And sometimes, late at night, when the road was quiet and the world seemed still, he could still hear the scratching. Epilogue: The Price of Curiosity. Jake Henderson quit the trucking business soon after that job. He sold his rig, moved to a small town far from the highways, and tried to forget. But no matter how hard he tried, the memories haunted him. The figures in his visions, the whispers in the night, they never truly left. He had opened the trailer. He had looked inside. And for that, he was forever cursed. And as for the cargo, it was never seen again. But rumors persisted, whispered among truckers late at night, about a haunted trailer that roamed the highways, carrying something far worse than freight. Some say it's still out there, waiting for its next unsuspecting driver.